The Mordor server had a stress test the other week. I want to express my initial thoughts. As a player, you have the right to know what you're getting into. Don't be misled by hype. First, I think I have reasonable grounds to say this. The 64-bit architecture is an improvement. The server is located in the Netherlands, pretty close to my own country. I'm not entirely sure whether this was down to the new architecture or the reduced latency. On live servers, I get about 90 latency. The Mordor server brought that down to 20. And sure, Lotro isn't a first-person shooter. You don't need perfect latency to have a smooth experience. But it does raise the question, especially to those over the pond, does lower latency improve performance? Well, in my view, not really. The main issue of Lotro's server lag comes from the sheer size of the game and antiquated engine. Over the years, Lotro has expanded to the point where I think it's starting to buckle under its own weight. You have a lot of systems piled onto each other, and that probably doesn't help either. But these issues have their own solutions, and in fact, there have been improvements implemented already. Quick fact that I think most people know already is that each character has its own server load added to it over time. For example, if you have a character that's completed thousands of quests and deeds, it would take longer to load into the game world than a freshly added character. A less widely known fact is that a lot of the huge lag spike problems the game has faced in previous years was in part due to exploits that would generate lag, especially during major downtimes in the previous years. It was all lag exploits. That's right, all those times you suffered from random disconnects. When you tried to reconnect, a character would appear with no clothes on, as if you could even log in at all because you'd be stuck with the dreaded closing old connection message. Those times where world chat would just bug out and not work for hours at a time, those were lag exploits. And among the many methods to perform these exploits, one of the most effective was to open and close the completed quest tab on a character, especially one with lots of quests completed on it. It was a particularly egregious pain point that people figured out could be exploited, and I don't care how wholesome you think the community is, people will fuck around with anything because they're just bored. Now, whatever they did to fix that exploit might have improved the game performance on a character with a long quest history. I'd argue this was a side effect more than anything. A good comparison to make would be the subserver loading in areas such as the Etten Moors. Not too long ago, they gave the Moors its own dedicated subserver. What this means is that they don't take up resources that areas outside the Moors would also use. This had the initial effect of making PvE raids and questing just a bit smoother even when PvP activity was high. But it goes both ways. So, PvP isn't affected by server stress from outside the Moors. The point is, I've heard from a good number of players that when this change was introduced, they noticed less lag in the Moors. Getting back on topic, however, I would say that the 64-bit servers will make a noticeable improvement on server performance, more so than latency. But I want to add a caveat here. We won't know if this is the case for all the other servers until 64-bit is rolled out fully. Mordor will be a new Legendary Server, meaning it's a blank slate. It doesn't have to put up with all the weight and bloat that long-standing servers have. Paired with the fact that it's a VIP-only server, it will have less player numbers anyway. I can't confidently say at this point in time that the 64-bit servers will fix the lag on the live servers. Simple logic dictates that there will be improvements, sure, but only if it's implemented correctly, and we simply won't know until that happens. As to the popularity of the new Mordor server, I've said it before and I'll reiterate it here. I'm not convinced that the whole Veil of the Nine gimmick will be that popular after the novelty wears off. Don't let the screenshots fool you. This was a stress test on the beta client. Everyone was able to instantly teleport to the action, and it was announced beforehand so that everyone knew when to log in for it. The Nazgul fights won't be anywhere near this popular when Mordor drops, and while the mechanics aren't finalised, I think it reveals enough to understand how the gimmick will play out. Lesser ring wraiths aren't all that interesting. That's just my opinion. Over time, it will probably be seen more as an annoyance than an engaging mechanic, and I think the Nazgul world bosses will get pretty old after the novelty wears off. There's also the question of balancing. The Rings of Power removes a 90% encourage damage buff on the boss. At the moment, the rings don't really have any special stats to justify the wow factor of finding them. How depressing would it be to get one of these cool rings, only to find that the stats are just worse than your current gear, so you leave them to collect dust in your inventory for 10 days, and maybe only put them on when you have to go out of your way to fight one of your Nazguls. Not really a good concept in my opinion. But I'm rambling here. The thing to focus on is that the main gimmick of the server isn't really game changing enough to warrant an entire new Legendary server dedicated to it. Take the previous Legendary servers for example. The difficulty system made landscape questing way more engaging and rewarding, and that stayed with you throughout the entire game. To those dedicated enough, they would get a unique title for it. And the Bombadil event server completely changed the way you played the game and interacted with players in a way never before done in Lotro. But the Veil of the Nine gimmick doesn't really compare to these. It is just that, a gimmick, nothing more. And that's not even touching the most common problem with these Legendary servers, that they just die after Rohan's released. I'm not saying that these servers will flop and not be worth your time to play. The very point of the Legendary servers is to play through content as though it's for cap. It's hands down the best way to experience some of the older instances and previous endgame zones. And yeah, maybe the additional world bosses might interest enough people to stick around once they hit the level cap. But if you're just playing for the gimmicky ring wraith mechanics alone, I cannot advocate for its long-term success. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Piss off.